They had a clue. They had a destination. But the sky had other plans. The carved word rested in John White's mind like a single lantern in a vast field of darkness. Croatoan. The only trace of the people he loved. The only thread that remained uncut. And so, as the surf rolled against the weathered hull of the anchored ships and the afternoon light softened over Roanoke Island, White made his decision. He would sail south. He would follow that word. He would find them, or he would know that he had done everything he could. The sailors around him moved quietly, adjusting rigging, securing crates, preparing for a short voyage they believed would offer quick resolution. A small jump along the coast. A simple crossing to a familiar island. But the air that afternoon carried a heaviness that none of them could ignore. A weight beneath the wind. A tension sitting low over the tree line. As though the sky itself were bracing for something it did not wish to reveal. John White stood on the deck and stared at the carved word one last time as the ships drifted away from the abandoned settlement. The empty houses leaned inward. The silent fort walls seemed to watch him leave. The clearing where laughter once echoed now held only scattered footprints softened by 3 years of wind. He lingered until distance blurred the memory of the colony into the pale horizon. Only then did he turn toward the open water. The ship creaked as it cut through the shallow edge of the outer banks. The water here was never forgiving. Sandbars shifted like living things. Currents collided without pattern. Storms rose without warning. Sailors who had spent their lives on calmer seas often spoke of this coast with a slow exhale, as if the very mention carried its own weight. The first hint of trouble came as a low vibration across the water, barely noticeable, just a pulse beneath the hull, a tremor in the rope. But the seasoned mariners aboard the pinnace recognized it. They exchanged glances. They watched the horizon. The sky to the southeast began to darken as though a curtain were being drawn across the world. The wind thickened. It no longer moved with the gentle, predictable rhythm of the morning breeze. Instead, it snatched at the sails with uneven bursts, like a hand gripping and releasing without warning. The gulls that had trailed the ship all day suddenly veered inland, their calls cutting sharply against the rising stillness. White felt the shift. He remembered storms from earlier voyages, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. Still, he urged them onward. Every moment mattered. Every mile closed the gap between uncertainty and whatever remained on Croatoan Island. If his daughter Eleanor lived, if his granddaughter Virginia breathed the salt air of that distant shore, he could not afford delay. The sailors nodded, their hands steady even as their eyes flicked toward the horizon. They would continue. They would push forward until the sea itself barred the way. By late afternoon, the sky had transformed. The blue had drained from it. What remained was a dull metallic grey that carried no distinction between sea, air, or cloud. A single sheet of colour pressed against the world. The first raindrops struck the deck like small, uncertain taps, light at first, scattered, almost polite. Then the wind shifted again. A deep groan rolled across the water, a sound like distant stone breaking beneath the weight of the earth. The rain intensified, turning from scattered taps to a steady curtain that obscured the horizon. Lines tightened, canvas strained. Voices rose above the growing roar, not in panic, but in controlled coordination. Commands spoken through clenched teeth as the ship began to heave under the rising swell. White moved to secure loose gear as the deck pitched beneath him. His clothes clung to his skin as rainwater pooled and flowed like miniature rivers around his boots. He gripped the rail as the ship lurched, and a cold realization settled through him. This was no ordinary storm. This was something far larger. Something that had been gathering long before they left the inlet. A tempest born beyond the horizon, now sweeping toward them with unrestrained force. The sailors lowered additional sail to prevent the masts from snapping. Ropes whipped through the air like living things resisting their bonds. The sea grew in size, each wave rising higher than the last, folding into itself with the ponderous certainty of rolling stone. The sound became immense, a continuous crash that swallowed every word and every thought. White could only watch as the world narrowed to a heaving deck, a screaming wind, and water rising from all directions. Night approached without meaning. The storm had consumed the sun long before it reached the horizon. Darkness came not as a gentle transition, but as a sudden thickening of the air, a deepening of shadows beneath the relentless rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, brilliant and jagged, illuminating the waves as towering forms that lunged and broke against the hull. Thunder followed in immense rolls, vibrating through the wood and bone of the vessel. White felt helpless. He had crossed oceans before. He had endured storms on previous voyages. He had known the risk of the sea. But this tempest carried a weight that seemed directed at his very purpose, a barrier between him and the truth he sought, a force with no face yet unmistakable intent. He held onto the rail as another wave crashed over the deck, cold and violent. The anchor cables strained against the churning water. The men had dropped anchor in a desperate attempt to stabilize the ship as they neared a hazardous inlet. They had hoped to ride out the worst of the storm, but the sea had other intentions. The cables tightened, stretching to their limit as the ship bucked like a trapped animal. Forearms flexed, hands tightened on wet rope. Every man aboard knew what would happen if the anchors failed. Another bolt of lightning illuminated the deck. In that brief flash, White saw the cable snap. It did not release with a sharp crack, but with a heavy, resonant shudder, as though the storm had torn through sinew rather than rope. The severed end whiplashed into the sea, disappearing instantly into the swirling dark. Shouts struggled to cut through the wind. The ship lurched free, now fully at the mercy of the tide. A moment later, the second anchor line followed. Another violent snap, another loss of stability. The ship twisted in the swell, pulled sideways by the surging current. Sailors stumbled, supplies shifted. The hull groaned as if protesting the strain placed upon it. White clung to a mast, his heart thundering in time with the relentless storm. The storm had grown even larger by this point. Waves broke over the bow, rising like jagged walls before collapsing onto the deck. Wood splintered under the pressure. The world became a confusion of rain, sea spray, and unsteady footing. Every breath tasted of salt and wind. Every heartbeat felt suspended between crashing waves. The sailors debated turning back. Their voices were barely audible, carried away as soon as they emerged. They gestured instead, pointing toward the direction of Croatoan Island, pointing toward the jagged line of shoals that separated them from it. The water around that inlet was treacherous even on clear days. Now, under a storm of this magnitude, it became impossible. White felt the truth of it before anyone spoke it aloud. To continue was to risk every life aboard. To reach for Croatoan now was not bravery but futility. The sea had closed its door. The storm had drawn its boundary. And White knew it, even as his heart resisted. He could not ask the men to push further. He could not demand they cross those deadly shoals in a hurricane. Hope, for the moment, was trapped behind a wall of wind and water. Another wave crashed. Another shudder rolled through the ship. They had no anchors. Their sails were damaged. Their hull was taking on water, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. White watched the mast sway under the strain. He watched the ropes pull taut again and again, each time threatening to give way. He watched the men fight the sea with everything they had left. And then the decision formed, quietly, painfully, inevitably. They would have to turn back. They would have to abandon the search for now, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked will, but because the storm held the power to end the voyage entirely. White lowered his head as the sailors began the slow, dangerous process of steering the crippled vessel northward. The return journey was not immediate relief. The storm pursued them. Waves continued to strike with violent force. The ship groaned under every impact. But gradually, as the hours dragged on, the wind began to shift. The rain softened. The sky lightened by imperceptible degrees. The sea, though still restless, began to release its grip. By dawn, the storm lay behind them, a vast wall of dark cloud retreating toward the horizon, leaving scattered debris and exhausted men in its wake. White stood at the rail, soaked, shivering, and silent. His eyes lingered on the dim outline of land to the west. Somewhere beyond that distant line was Croatoan Island. Somewhere beyond it might have been his daughter and granddaughter. Alive or gone, he could not know. The sailors approached him cautiously. They respected his grief. They respected his authority. But they also knew their duty. Their ship required repairs. Their supplies were dwindling. Their obligation was to return to England while the sea still allowed passage. White listened. He nodded. He understood. When the ship finally turned east, leaving the Carolina coast behind, White held onto the rail once more. The morning light cast long reflections across the water, soft and muted after the violence of the night. The waves rolled gently now, as though offering apology for what had passed. He watched the shoreline shrink until it became nothing more than a faint memory in the shifting mist. The word Croatoan remained carved in his thoughts, the last sign of the people he loved, the final trace of a colony that had vanished into the tangled history of a distant shore. He had come so close to learning the truth. A single storm had stood between him and the answers he sought, and now he sailed homeward, burdened not by certainty, but by the weight of unknowing. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead. England lay far beyond the horizon. but all of White's thoughts remained behind him. On the island he could not reach, on the people he could not find, on the lives that might still be out there, waiting on a shore he would never stand upon again. The wind filled the patched sails. The crew settled into the long journey across the Atlantic. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The distance grew, the memory remained. The unanswered questions deepened into the quiet recesses of John White's mind. He would never return to Roanoke. He would never know what became of his daughter. He would never hold his granddaughter again. All that remained was the carved word, the unclaimed clue, and the storm that sealed the path between them. The ship drifted farther into open water. The horizon closed. The journey home began. And John White carried with him the silent weight of a truth lost to wind, tide, and the unrelenting sea.